Hey there. Welcome to the Health and Harmony podcast, where your health and harmony is our mission. I'm Chrissy Rice, a spiritual wellness coach, joined by Mike Fave, an independent researcher and health clinician. And on today's episode, get ready for it. We're going to talk about bloating and gas and digestive issues at the same time. All right, Mike. Everyone has these issues, I feel, and they can be quite uncomfortable for some. So what causes all of this bloating and gas within our digestive system, and how can we make it stop?
This is a great question, Chrissy. I think a lot of people are dealing with this, and I think that some people just assume that it's the norm, and then other people just have no idea what to do. And I think you have people in your life, whether that's friends or family, and I have a variety of clients as well as friends and family that are really struggling with this bloated and gassy issue. And this is also something that I struggled with when I was younger, and I noticed that it also really bothered my cognitive function. And so that's what initially prompted me to go towards a low carbohydrate diet to deal with this issue. And I think a lot of people are shifting towards low carbohydrate diet to actually deal with this issue. So this is a really pertinent question. And there's a couple major factors that I think are involved with causing the bloating and gas issue. It also can run into constipation and diarrhea and GERD, which is acid reflux and things like this. And the major ones that I want to talk about today are going to be different food sources of certain types of fermentable fibers like FODMAPs, food intolerances, so actually having a negative reaction to certain foods because of some of their components, being on a low-calorie diet for a really long period of time, things like SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, hypothyroidism, low stomach acid, and then a poor dietary setup or issues with bile flow. I think these are some of the major components that you can run through to determine, are one of these things driving this bloating and this gas and these different digestive problems. So before we jump into each of them, I want to leave the floor here for your thoughts and feelings on these different elements.
Yeah, you're saying all of these things could be contributing. So this is going to be a lengthy trial and error for everyone to try and see which one of those is the cause of your bloating and gas. And some people have bloating and no gas. So like they can't get the bloating to go away. And then some people just have all the gas in the world. So I guess let's start with the FODMAPs and talk about those and how they can affect, because those don't really affect me that much, but I do know they affect a lot of people that I do know. So
yes. So the other thing, the one thing I want to, before we jump into FODMAPs, we're going to lay this out so people can figure out what is, kind of narrow down what is the actual culprit in their particular circumstance. We're going to talk about the solutions here and what you can do to solve these problems so that you can get rid of the bloating and gas. And it's important to kind of go through things systematically, but it may also resolve relatively quickly. I think for the vast majority of people I work with, they don't have significant digestive issues, but they're just dealing with bloating and gas. And this leads us into our first topic. Just minimizing or figuring out which FODMAPs you have an issue with makes a huge difference in the bloating and gas symptoms. Now, what are FODMAPs, right? That's the question. What is this guy talking about with FODMAPs? What's a FODMAP? I remember the first time we talked about it, and you're like, what's a FODMAP, Mike? Because I think I just threw it out there, and because of course, everybody knows what FODMAPs are. And I kind of assumed, and you're like, what's a FODMAP?
Yep.
So
never heard of it in my life.
Yeah. I mean, it comes out of it's a research term. It's becoming more prevalent now because people are figuring out that it actually causes digestive issues. But FODMAPs are types of sugars or carbohydrates that our body can't break down. We don't have the enzymes to break these things down. So what winds up happening is these sugars go into the digestive tract, and the bacteria in the digestive tract, bacteria, fungi, different microbes, are actually able to use these sugars to produce different types of gases and metabolites that can cause, bloating, gas, diarrhea, constipation, etc., depending upon what type of bacteria is present. And FODMAPs actually is an acronym. It's not a word, it's an acronym, and it stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And all those things are just types of sugars. So they're different types of sugar compounds. Now, before we get in, I'm going to talk about the different breakdown of the different types. But before we get in there, I think when we first started, just as an example of how important this was, there was a specific FODMAP that I think you weren't dealing very well with, Chrissy. And we've talked about this before, but it was lactose from dairy, which is a big one. So I don't know if you want to let people like kind of share your experience, if perhaps, unless it's TMI, on what it was like dealing with lactose.
Yeah, nothing's TMI for me. You know that. Yeah, my family doesn't really like when I eat too much lactose. I'm very gassy and very bloated when I eat too much lactose. However, I still love it. So it's hard, but yes, I did figure that out, that lactose is one of those things that definitely makes me gassy and bloated.
Yeah. So lactose is considered a FODMAP. Lactose is actually considered a disaccharide. So it's a combination of glucose and galactose. And after a certain age, we can't digest it, or a large portion of us can't digest it because we don't have the enzyme lactase. And so for a lot of these carbohydrate sources, it's essentially the same thing. We don't have the enzymes to break them down. So we get the same problems oftentimes that we would see with something like lactose. So it's a good example. So with that said, when we're looking at these different FODMAPs, the first group we have are oligosaccharides, and they're broken down into fructans and galacto-oligosaccharides. Now, these components, I know that probably doesn't mean much of anything, but basically what you see is these components are in things like beans, asparagus, beetroot, chicory, onions, garlic, different grains like barley, rye, and wheat, and then also in added fiber sources like inulin or even fructo-oligosaccharides that you see on labels. So also soy is another big one. So if a lot of these foods will cause bloating and gas in people, and it's not because you have a dysbiosis or you have problems in your intestine, it's because they contain these carbohydrates, and it's actually normal to get bloating and gas from some of these different carbohydrate sources, and it would depend on your digestive function and also on your microbiome and the bacteria that you have present. So that's one group that covers the oligosaccharides. The other group is disaccharides, and the main one that we already covered is lactose. So that's in all types of dairy, milk, soft and unripened cheeses, yogurt, ice cream, depending on how it's made, and other types of desserts, depending on how it's made. And again, a portion of us can't actually digest it because we don't have the lactase enzyme, so we're lactose intolerant. So again, bloating, gas, diarrhea, things like this. The next group is monosaccharides. So the monosaccharides, the main one is fructose. Now, fructose is actually completely normally absorbed without any issue. It doesn't have to be broken down if it has equal amounts of glucose present. So that's when you're looking at, you can put the food into Chronometer, and Chronometer will show you the breakdown between glucose and fructose. And if it's 1-to-1, there's no problem. However, if you have more fructose than you have glucose, say you have 50 grams of glucose and you have 75 grams of glucose, you have and 75 grams of fructose, you have an extra 25 grams of fructose, which is likely to be unabsorbed in a large portion of people, which can cause bloating and gas. So some food sources where we'll see the fructose will be apples, figs, mangoes, pears, watermelon, agave syrup, corn syrup, depending on the amount of fructose present, and things like honey, depending on the variety of honey. So these are some foods that may cause bloating and gas. The next group and the last group we have are polyols. Now, polyols are sugar alcohols, and they can be added to foods directly. So we have things like mannitol, maltitol, isomalt, xylitol, sorbitol, and erythritol. But we also have different fruits present, like the stone fruits. So apples, apricots, peaches, pears, plums, prunes. Then we also have things like blackberries, cherries, longans, lychees. And you also have different vegetables like cauliflower, certain mushrooms, and then things like snow peas. So if you're having, this is just a list of some of these foods in these different groups. And essentially there's lists online you could see for the different FODMAP breakdown. There's a university called Monash University that actually founded this FODMAP idea, or put the FODMAP idea into play. And so there's a lot of resources there where you can see which foods may or may not be problematic. So overall, avoiding some of these foods will help you to actually drastically minimize your bloating and your gas, because again, we're not digesting these different carbohydrate sources. And the one thing that I think is important to point out, and this is something that you mentioned, Chrissy, was that the FODMAP tolerance is inter-individual. So for you, you don't do well with lactose, but a lot of those other foods, not really a
Yeah.
problem for you. For
No.
me, I do fine with certain FODMAP foods like broccoli, but I don't do well with certain FODMAP foods like yams. And so I also don't do well. Well, I actually can tolerate lactose fine. So there's a lot of individual variance here, and that's important to understand.
Yes. Yeah. And it's all trial and error, and you might have stronger reactions than others. Like I might eat, or the amounts that you're eating, right? Like if you're eating too many apples, you might start to exhibit some FODMAP repercussions, right? But I mean,
Yes.
you might eat an apple or a little bit of applesauce and you might not get that reaction. So it's really about quantity as well.
Yeah. And the cooking process. So, like cooking apples down and cooking them with a bit of a sugar source so that you can balance out the fructose to glucose ratio. So, maybe you cook the apples with a bit of fruit juice. Maybe you throw a little dextrose in there, which is pure glucose. You balance the glucose to fructose ratio, and you don't really have a problem with sorbitol, which is a sugar alcohol high in apples. Then you may be able to digest cooked apples just fine.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things that you can do to adjust. And again, just because you don't tolerate some of these foods doesn't necessarily mean that you have problems with your gut. It just could be a normal function of some of these foods. And what I'd say is, I would say like 90% or more of people that I work with don't do well with raw apples, don't do well with things like mangoes, don't do well with things like high amounts of cruciferous vegetables or beans. They get bloating and gas. The other
Mm-hmm.
thing I'll say is, if you get bloating and gas, doesn't necessarily mean that this is like a really terrible thing. It's just because of those carbohydrates. So it really depends. Like if you get a little bit of gas from eating beans and you don't mind it, no big deal.
Right.
But if you get a lot and you're like really uncomfortable, then yeah, I would minimize the beans.
Yeah, actually, I just figured out a nice little trick that actually works for me to be able to digest beans better. I actually soak them overnight and then I cook them in the crock pot for 12 hours.
Yeah.
Don't have any issues.
So that's actually a really good point as well. And this leads us into our next topic, and that's food intolerances. So different foods will contain different compounds that can be really irritating to the intestine. And so beans and grains and nuts and seeds in general tend to have high amounts of different components called lectins, and also components called trypsin inhibitors that can impair the digestion directly by impairing the digestive enzymes like the trypsin enzyme, which breaks down proteins. And it also contains things like phytic acid that binds up minerals. So there's a lot of components on top of the FODMAPs in some of these foods that can be really irritating to the digestive tract and cause issues and inflammatory responses that will lead to bloating, gas, diarrhea, constipation, etc. That isn't necessarily because of FODMAPs, but it could be because some of these other components. And so as an example, beans are one that can contain high amounts of lectins. If people were eating certain beans raw, the lectins in these beans can actually cause ulceration in the intestine, and they can be extremely damaging, because once the lectin causes the ulceration, it gets into the bloodstream and triggers an extreme immune response. So it's quite negative. But again, the solution here with these is, number one, either avoid it if you have a problem, or number two, you can cook for example, when you cook beans, you drastically minimize the lectin content because the heating process destroys the lectin. So this is something to keep in mind as well, is maybe it's not a FODMAP. Maybe it could be an intolerance to certain food like a bean because of the lectin, or a big one is wheat. A lot of people find that wheat really irritates their intestine or causes different inflammatory symptoms. This could be because it's high in something like fructans, or it could be because it's high in gluten and something called wheat germ agglutinin, which can both directly open up the intestinal lining and cause a variety of gnarly symptoms in susceptible people. So this is where, in that case, it's not because you have a bad gut or because there's something wrong with you. It could just be par for the course for these specific foods.
Yes. Yeah. And that was a trial and error thing with me because I didn't do very well with beans, but I was like, and beans are like the most hearty thing in the entire world. You can cook them for 3 days and they look exactly like they did on day one. So you can cook beans forever. And the longer you cook beans, the better they are for my digestion anyway.
Yeah. And that's because the beans also have a very thick and heavy food matrix.
Yes.
So the food matrix of the beans, the fibers present and the protein structure makes them very difficult to break down and digest. So soaking, sprouting, and also cooking them for long periods of time or pressure cooking them or things like this makes them much more digestible overall. And they actually have to be made that way. And the reason that occurs is because things like beans are the progeny of plants. So the plants are making it difficult for other organisms, other animals to actually eat their progeny. So it's a chemical warfare effect. So they're making it hard to digest. They're adding components that really irritate the digestive tract, basically say, hey, like you shouldn't be eating these things. With that said, the beans do have a pretty dense nutrient profile overall. So there's some benefits to them if you tolerate them, but ideally they really need to be prepared well. And oftentimes for myself, I completely avoid them because of the digestive issues. Whereas things like fruits, which are made to be eaten, so that you spread the seeds, are way easier to digest. And they do still provide a decent amount of micronutrients as well. Although beans, again, are quite rich, but something to be mindful of is that the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals inside beans, because of the food matrix and these components, is actually not very bioavailable. It's much harder to access. So even though they look rich on paper, same thing with nuts and seeds, they're actually not that accessible to us. So it can actually create problems in the long run versus something like animal protein or animal food sources or even some fruits and tubers. And we'll talk about those in a sec, but I want to leave the floor here for your thoughts and feelings, Chrissy.
Yeah. I just love experimenting with all of this stuff and figuring it all out. I don't know. I have fun doing it. Most people are probably like, this is exhausting. Why do I keep getting bloated? But I don't know. It's sort of a science experiment for me.
Yeah, but I think it's super helpful because you're really good at finding unique strategies and ways to make some of the foods taste better, create recipes that avoid these problems,
right.
which are all listed inside your Metabolic Eats cookbook. I want to drop that here for people.
That's
if they're
right.
looking for different options and recipes that they can use to still like eat tasty foods, but not have some of these irritating lectin or FODMAP components.
Yes, I tried to make all of the recipes non-bloating and gassy for people because that is the worst feeling in the entire world. So
yes. Yeah, that's awesome. So I want to add a couple other intolerance or components that could create intolerances. So we talked about lectins and digestive inhibitors in beans, nuts, seeds, and legumes, the beans would be the legumes and grains. But there's the other component are different things like alkaloids. So alkaloids are plant compounds. The major ones that people have issues with are solanine and chaconine that are found in something like the nightshade family. So that's peppers, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, things like this. And they actually block some enzymatic function in our body. The enzyme is called acetylcholinesterase, and it breaks down the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and it can cause toxicity when you have a high amount of acetylcholine build up. And so the solution is, number one, if you heat these foods up to about 210 degrees Celsius or 410 degrees Fahrenheit, which would probably be done in the oven or broiling, that can actually start to break down these different components pretty well. So baked potatoes or French fries that are baked in the oven are a great option. The other thing is, in something like potatoes, the alkaloids are actually concentrated within the first couple millimeters of the plant. So basically around the skin. And the reason why it's in those areas specifically is because those areas are where they're trying to prevent pests like insects and different worms and components from actually attacking the potato and eating the potato, because the potato is supposed to be the storage organ of the plant. So it's where the plant stores all the sugars and things for later use. And so that's its defense process. So if you peel a potato nice and well, you get the skin off and you minimize the first couple millimeters, like I think it's between 2 and 5 millimeters of potato flesh with a peeler, which millimeters is very, very thin, very small. You can drastically minimize the alkaloids present if you aren't tolerating the potatoes. And this also flies directly in the face of people saying, oh, you should eat potato skin because it's so super nutrient dense and it'll improve your blood glucose response. If anything, I would highly avoid eating the potato skin. And if you want to improve your blood glucose response, then eat the potato in the context of a whole meal. So have your baked potato fries with your steak and your cooked carrots and your glass of grape juice, and then your blood glucose will be managed because of the protein and the fat and the fiber content. And you don't necessarily need to eat the potato skin. It's not going to like add this extra component. And you'll also minimize the toxic alkaloid component, especially if you're sensitive to it. And the nutrient of the potato skin, especially in the amount that somebody's eating, and especially its absorbability or bioavailability, is very low. So that's also not an argument for eating potato skins. Now, the last piece I want to talk about here with the alkaloids, particularly in the nightshade family, is with something like peppers, you want to, or even eggplant, you want to avoid, again, the seeds and the skin, because those components are enriched in the alkaloids overall, because the plant basically doesn't want those, the plant doesn't want the seeds to be digested. It wants it to pass through the digestive tract, and then it doesn't want the skins. The skins are supposed to be a protective mechanism so insects aren't eating the plant. Ideally, what's eating the plant is going to be mammals or other larger animals who will then pass the seeds through their digestive tract somewhere else. And now that's how the plant is spreading its seeds. So the plant wants you to eat these foods, but doesn't want the insects. So that's why the skin contains those components. And it also doesn't want you to digest the seeds, which is why the seeds contain those components. And oftentimes the seeds are very indigestible overall. They usually just pass through the digestive tract. The last piece, or just a little caveat or nuance to add here, is if you have unripe fruits in the nightshade family, the alkaloid content's higher. So a green potato or a green tomato is going to be way worse in terms of content than a very ripe, juicy, fragrant red tomato. In that sense, there's probably going to be much lower alkaloid content because, again, the plant actually wants this fruit to be eaten now. So as the fruit ripens, oftentimes the protective plant compounds decrease. And this is why a lot of people have issues with unripe fruits, because they're higher in protective compounds for the plant, because the plant's saying, look, my tomato is not ready to eat yet. Like the masterpiece needs a little bit more time. So we're going to deter you from eating this thing.
Yeah. Okay. So I have 3 things to say.
Okay.
The first thing is you totally myth busted on, my grandpa used to say all the time, make sure you eat your potato skin because it's got all the nutrients in it. So we totally myth busted that. Second thing, how must one prepare an eggplant if you can't eat the seeds or the skin? So just don't eat it at all, because it's like impossible to take the seeds out of an eggplant.
So the eggplant, a lot of times people don't actually eat the skin, but the seeds, the part of so it's not really that you need to avoid the seeds in eggplant or tomato, because it's impossible. It is impossible, as you say. They will largely just pass through uneaten, like undigested. So that's not as much of a problem. But for peppers, if you can avoid the seeds, like I would, if you can avoid the seeds, avoid them.
Yeah.
But if you can't, with tomato or eggplant, I don't think it's a problem, because again, like most of the time they just pass through like pretty easily. So for me, I like all of these foods. I'm Italian, so I really like these different foods. It's part of the cuisine. And so I eat them all the time, but I just I make sure they're very ripe. And, I'm not eating like eggplant skin, but I'm eating mostly the fresh, like the fried eggplant. And then for peppers, I'll clean out the bell peppers. I'll take the seeds out. And then tomatoes, if it's a really big tomato, sometimes you can get some of the seeds out, but like the little cherry ones, we cook them up with the seeds in and we just eat them as is.
I feel like, because you said if you cook them to 400 degrees, that's helping it even more. So
well, the seeds, you won't even, like most of the seeds there are just really hard and small. So we don't really break them down. They're meant to be indigestible. The plant makes them indigestible. And if you eat a bunch of tomatoes or something, like you'll see the seeds come out on the other side.
They go in exactly how they come out. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really, if you're like trying to chew and open up the seeds by breaking them down in that sense. But in general, that shouldn't be a problem. It's only if you start like really trying to eat and break down the seeds that it becomes an issue. Even goji berries, which are in the nightshade family as well, their seeds pass all the way through. Like if you eat a bunch of goji berries, like you're just going to see goji berry seeds on the other side.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. My third thing was you just disappointed a whole bunch of Southern people saying that green tomatoes aren't as good as red. So that too.
Yeah, I think it's best if you're really having digestive issues to avoid eating the unripe fruits,
Yeah.
because they'll have more defensive compounds present in them, and that's a general rule. Obviously, things adjust based on certain fruits, but overall, like the more unripe the fruit is, or the worse growing conditions it has, the more defensive compounds it has, and the more allergens it has.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
That is my favorite group of all of those groups because I don't have any adverse reactions to any of those foods, but I do know a lot of people that do have adverse reactions to those foods. That's a
yeah.
pretty common one, actually, to have reactions to that little group right there.
Yeah, and it's pretty easy to minimize too. And some people may respond to one nightshade vegetable or fruit, but not in others. So like some
Right.
people maybe do fine with potatoes if they're cooked well and peeled
Yeah.
versus like peppers or eggplant or something. And some people may not do as well with the potato, but they'll do better with tomatoes or something like this. So
Right.
again, it really comes down to testing out individual tolerance to the different foods. But I'm just trying to give some categories of foods that people can look at and see, oh, this is why I'm having this reaction to this or that reaction to that.
Yeah, there's somebody listening right now saying, I eat all of these foods. And they're like, this is what my problem is. Like their light bulb is on right now. They're
Yeah.
like super excited, but very disappointed at the same time.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a shakeup in the beginning, but once you get a handle on it, you start to figure out what foods work for you. It makes
Yeah.
a huge difference. And I think a lot of people expect or assume that they should be able to digest everything and eat everything.
Mm.
And in my experience, that's not the case. I think a lot of people, there's very specific sets of foods that their body tolerates and does well with, and they need to figure out what those are. So even for me, there's a set list of foods that I know, like I can eat these things as much as I want and I feel fine. I don't have any digestive problems. And then there's like a list of foods that I know it's like, yeah, it's not terrible. It's not amazing, but I like them enough that I'm going to keep eating them. And then there's a bunch of foods that are just like hard nose. It's just,
Yes.
yeah, I'm definitively not going to eat this thing because I know I'm going to suffer if
Yeah.
I eat it. And so I think for a lot of people, that's the case, and they just go throughout their lives and they don't actually realize like, oh, I'm actually sensitive to some of these things
Mm-hmm.
because as we grow up, when we eat these very varied diets in the West, oftentimes like, oh, I can eat everything. I can have Thai on Monday and Italian on Tuesday and Indian on Wednesday and American food on Thursday. And Friday, we're going to get Chinese food. And Saturday, we're going to get pizza. And you should tolerate all of these things. It's like, not necessarily. A lot of times, if you look in the past, a lot of cultures, a lot of when people like had a particular area that they came from, that they developed in, they developed their genetics in, their epigenetics, their history is from, that there was this like a set group of foods that they were tolerating. That doesn't mean that they can't tolerate other foods, but the idea I think is it's not that we should have this super varied diet and the more varied it's better. It's like we want to hit all of our macronutrients and micronutrients, but with foods that aren't causing problems for us. And just because you don't tolerate something like beans doesn't mean you have a digestive issue. It
Mm-hmm.
means that you just don't tolerate beans well. So that could also be an answer.
Right. Right. All
Yeah.
trial and error.
Yes. But guided trial and error. So you're not just like, all right, well, here's 5,000 different foods. Let me just try
No.
them one by one.
No. Yeah. And notice what you ate that night. If there was 5 FODMAPs that you had that night and you have tons of bloating and gas, then you have to go and break down those 5 FODMAPs and be like, all right, which one was it? Because it might not be all 5. It might just be one that you ate.
Yeah. Some other options just briefly before we jump into the next section here. Some people have issues with dairy protein like casein, so that can cause problems. Some people have issues with eggs because eggs also have some proteins in them like lysozyme, ovomucoid, and then something called avidin. That avidin binds biotin. The other proteins can be irritating or inflammatory for some people. So in that case, some people may get digestive issues from eggs or the high cysteine content. It's an amino acid in the egg protein. Can cause some issues for some people. So that would cause like the sulfur gas and things that people get if they eat a lot of eggs. So in those circumstances, again, like if you get a little bit of gas from eggs, is it really that big of a deal? Probably not. But if it's like really uncomfortable, and it could possibly be something like the eggs. And so those are where you start to figure out, okay, this works for me, this doesn't work for me, and then run from there. So those are just some other quick options. Now, the next component I want to talk about, and this was the one that you wanted to really talk about in this specific podcast, Chrissy, was SIBO.
Yes.
So SIBO is called, or is an acronym that means small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So it is an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine. And now the question is, why is this actually a problem? Well, in the small intestine, that's where your body's trying to absorb the food you bring in. So if you have a bunch of bacteria in there, now you have to compete against these bacteria for the food absorption. And then what happens, the bacteria produce gas and metabolites that are can be really irritating or problematic to the body while you're trying to digest your food. So it's like every time you eat, you're getting poisoned by these bacterial metabolites. So the SIBO can really be uncomfortable. And it's caused by a variety of things. But I think, I don't know if you want to add any thoughts or feelings, or you had any specific questions about SIBO before I jump in and talk about it further.
Yeah, that was my one question, is like, how the heck did it get in there? Like, how did you get bacteria in your small intestine? And that's what's mind-boggling to me. So that's kind of why I wanted to really include this in this episode, because there are a lot of people that get diagnosed with it. And then the doctor tells them, oh, you have SIBO. Here's some medicine. And that's it. There's no like, how to get there. What did I do wrong? How do I avoid it happening in the future? Like, you're not supposed to have bacteria in there. So what did I do wrong to get it there?
Yeah. So this is a great question. Now, basically your intestine, your small intestine, has a bunch of mechanisms, your intestinal tract overall, to eliminate bacteria from being high up in the digestive tract, like the stomach or in the small intestine. And so some of those components is our saliva and our in our oral cavity and whatnot, we produce antimicrobial components that can help to minimize bacterial growth, formation, and development. The other thing is the lining of our mouth and our esophagus and our stomach and our intestine has components called secretory IgA. It was secretory immunoglobulins, where we have immunoglobulins, and we also have mucus lining. And what the mucus and the IgA do is they prevent bacteria and microbes from sticking and forming biofilms to our soft tissues. So it's very slippery essentially. So the bacteria and microbes can't adhere and they can't develop and grow that way. Our saliva and our different digestive juices are inhibiting growth. For example, the first thing we do with food after we chew it up and mush it up into to create an increased surface area is we dump it in our stomachs, and our stomachs drastically increase the acidity level to extremely high levels of acidity. And what winds up happening is that kills a lot of stuff. Right. It's basically like a sterilization process, on top of the fact that we add in different enzymes, protein digesting enzymes, that further can degrade and kill different microorganisms that would be present in our foods. Then after that, the next thing we do is we dump it into our small intestine, and our bile acids actually kill a variety of microbes as well. And then the bile acids trigger our small intestine to increase immune defense and a defensive response as well, that further kills and impairs bacteria from adhering to the food. And then when the food gets into the colon, we have a very tight valve on the bottom end called the ileocecal valve, and it stops food and bacteria from backflowing from the colon into the small intestine. So our digestive tract has all these processes to minimize bacterial growth or microbial growth and formation, basically kill the things that are coming in, so that we sterilize our food a bit, so that we can absorb the nutrients from our food in our small intestine, because our small intestine has all these little finger-like projections called villi and microvilli. The microvilli are on the villi, and it increases the surface area of the intestine, so we can absorb. We can absorb all the nutrients coming in, plus the stomach meters out the food coming in small dosages. So again, we can absorb that food on a regular basis. Now, a problem, one other point before I get to the problem. The other thing is our intestinal tract is moving food through relatively quickly, particularly the stomach, small intestine, and the oral cavity, so that bacteria don't have the time, or the food doesn't have time to sit there and fester and grow bacteria as well. Versus in the colon, transit time slower, we have microbes present, And then that's where we get more of the fermentation. So we want to have, it's not that we want to, but we will have bacteria present in the colon no matter what, or microbes present. Even if you nuke everything out with antibiotics, you'll still eventually have microbes present there. But the small intestine, stomach, you won't really have much microbes present. The oral cavity has a very high amount of microbes, but not as whenever the food hits the stomach or small intestine, everything kind of gets nuked out and killed. So basically, problems start to arise when any of those areas get messed up. Low stomach acid production, issues with bile production, issues with transit time. If the intestine doesn't have enough energy on a regular basis to undergo its functions because you have a low calorie diet or something like this, that can cause problems. And also hormonal issues like hypothyroidism or problems with the gallbladder can also cause issues in these areas and predispose for SIBO. Or if you have dysbiosis in the colon where your bacterial populations become very pathogenic, that can also cause issues as well. So there's a variety of reasons or things that can drive the SIBO process. And it's, trying to figure out which one is it your stomach acid's low? Are you hypothyroid? Are you dealing with an estrogen dominance that's leading to issues like gallstones and sluggish bile that's causing issues with clearing out bacteria in the small intestine? Is your transit time very low? Are you on a very low calorie diet? And so the intestine is struggling because it doesn't have enough energy to maintain the mucus structure. On your very low carb diet, so you don't have enough carbohydrates to maintain mucus structure and things like this. Did you get an infection from going to Mexico and partying super hard and eating street food and getting a parasite? Or things like this? All of these components can contribute to SIBO, and the solution is to reverse those effects. So before we get into that, I want to give you the floor here, Chrissy, for your thoughts, opinions, experience, feelings, etc. with these different elements.
I have a question. So if somebody does not have a gallbladder, are they more susceptible to something like this?
In general, I think if somebody has a gallbladder, they're more susceptible to a variety of digestive problems overall because they either don't have enough bile to clear out the small intestine and absorb fats effectively, right, and signal appropriately, or they have too much bile, which causes problems inside the colon in terms of the microbiome, and then you can start to run into issues with dysbiosis and irritation to the colon and elevations in things like serotonin, which are inflammatory, particularly peripheral serotonin, and have a negative impact on metabolism. So yeah, it's a huge problem. And also it's a huge problem for people who get their stomachs cut out for bariatric surgeries.
Right. I was going to say, so is this like a test that you need to test like your bile production? And like, what if you do have low bile? How do you change that? Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like,
yeah. So go ahead.
Do you have to go through a series of tests after you find out you have SIBO to find out what the cause of it was?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
So you could go through and do all these tests, but it's super expensive. Right? You could do a GI map. You could do all your blood testing. You could do tests to see there's a test to see if you're dumping bile in your stool. You could do all this type of stuff, but it's super expensive overall.
Right.
So for me, the way I went about it to deal with my issues and the way I talk about it with clients is kind of an empirical approach. And so essentially what you can do is if you're, say, just looking at your diet, if you're at a really low fat or low calorie diet, start to correct that.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't have SIBO. Maybe you just have digestive problems from that. If you're dealing with a microbial overgrowth in the intestine, or maybe you picked up a bug in Mexico, Montezuma's Revenge, whatever the thing is, you can run a little bit of essential oils, oregano oil, Ceylon cinnamon oil, and see if that helps to kick the symptoms back. And that'll give you an idea, is it a bacterial or microbial thing? And if you're responding well to those things, then it probably is.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if your bile acid flow is low or there's problems there, if you're on a really low fat diet, try to add in some fat sources, long chain fats like olive oil or beef tallow or butter or chocolate or something like this. And maybe shoot for like 15, 20, 30 grams per meal. See if that starts to move the needle. You can also play around with ox bile and a bile acid called TUDCA, toro-urso-deoxycholic acid, which will provide some bile acid. Some people are pretty bad issues with constipation. Fine, using those can be really helpful. The other thing you could do for low stomach acid is try something called betaine HCl. See if that starts to move the needle. So you can try these different components out and see if any one of them starts to help you to feel better. And then you can get a gauge on, is it my stomach acid? Is it the bile acids? I just not eating enough calories? Am I dealing with an overgrowth or something like this? And then you kick it back a little bit with the essential oils or some herbal components. And then basically, if you start to notice benefits in those different areas, you can say, oh, okay, like it's probably this. I'm going to set things up. This is what I do with clients. I'll set up a gut protocol because it seems like I'm responding to either the probiotic or to the spore biotic or the essential oils or herbal stuff. It's like, oh, it's probably something going on bacterial in the gut, and I can fix it with this. When it's something hormonal, that you may want to do some testing to see if there's something going on with thyroid. But you can kind of gauge if your hands and feet are always cold, if you're constipated, if you're sluggish, if your digestion is off, if you have anxiety, you're dealing with a variety of these symptoms. If your waking temperatures are pretty low, they're lower than 97.8 in the morning, then you can assume that there may be something going on with thyroid, and it can give you some indication as well. So you kind of get this overall picture, right? And say like, oh, if I do these different things, I see this result, and that gives you some information in a different direction without having to do a lot of expensive testing. Because even if you were to buy the ox bile, the essential oils, some spore biotics, some betaine HCl, that would still be cheaper than all of the lab testing by even one of the types of lab testing, the GI map or the GI stool test, or even blood testing. All of those things would still be significantly cheaper, probably under $100, to test these different components out in a systematic way, instead of having to go through and do all this testing. And then based on your results, then you can narrow down what type of tests you need to do after as well. And again, a lot of times with clients, I just fix their diet and things are fine. And we don't even do the testing. It's just like, they show me their diet in Chronometer, and I'm like, all right, you're really high in FODMAPs. You have a bunch of components that are problematic. Your fat intake is super low, and your protein intake isn't high enough. And then I fix those things like, oh, I don't have any digestive problems anymore. Yeah. And then it's like, yeah, so you probably don't need to spend $1,000 in testing at this point. I think you're probably good to go. And these are likely the problems.
Yes. So and the waiting too to take those tests. It take a year to get all those tests done. Nobody has time for all that bloating and gas. We got to get rid of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why for me, I like the empirical approach. There's minimal downsides to a lot of those different components. They're all over the counter supplementary things. Maybe the essential oils, some people, it can give you the runs or something like this, but when you stop, it shouldn't be super problematic. And there are studies inside PubMed running herbal compounds. A lot of them are based around the essential oils to clear out bacterial overgrowth inside the intestine. So, and also like probiotics and betaine HCl and ox bile and stuff like that. These are all normal stuff. So you're not even worried about getting a prescription. All this stuff you can pick up online. Right. On Amazon or something like this, and test out and see what the result is. But one thing I would keep in mind is I would always fix the diet first, because a lot of times people are running these protocols and they don't fix their diet, and then they feel better, and then they come off, and now they're back to the same problem again. The foundation needs to be solidified first before you can go into these other components and have them work how you want them to work. And this is why, I mean, if you're looking to set up your foundation, I do have the nutrition blueprint available on my website. It's a free video series with a PDF guide to help you set some of the dietary stuff up. So you can check that out at mikefave.com. So yeah, these are just different components to consider, and make sure the foundation is set up before you actually start to run through these next systematic components, so that you don't waste your money on those as well. It's like, if it was just that you're eating sweet potato 3 meals a day and it's bloating you and you're getting gassy, it's like, okay, let's just stop the sweet potato. Let's try the easiest option before we get to this like really in-depth and nutrition and supplements and testing and all this stuff.
Yeah. It's a journey, guys, not a destination.
Yeah.
We're on a journey.
Well, for you, Chrissy, when we set your diet up, you were having a bunch of digestive issues. And we just switched things around, and we didn't have to run a gut protocol or anything. As soon as we changed your diet, you were completely fine. You were wondering, like, do I have like SIBO or something going on in my digestion? It's like, no, you're just eating a crap ton of beans and grains.
And seeds. I love me some seeds. But yes, stop eating those things and everything feels better.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
It is.
So.
All right. So what's next on the list? Was SIBO the last thing that you were talking about?
So all of the components that I kind of covered in SIBO. So like, I guess we could run through. So with low calorie dieting,
Yeah.
the two most important or most energy intensive source functions in the body are digestion and cognition.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're not like doing really low calorie dieting, your deficit or whatever you're doing is not set up appropriately, oftentimes digestion starts to really take a hit and struggle. And that's because your digestive tract requires quite a bit of energy to function. The next one is hypothyroidism. So thyroid helps to control digestive transit time, stomach acid production, liver function, and all this type of stuff. So if your thyroid function is pretty poor, that can cause issues with digestive issues in SIBO and whatnot, because you're allowing the bacteria to develop because you don't have a high amount of stomach acid and your transit is slow and all these different components. Also, if you have a high estrogen to progesterone ratio, you're estrogen dominant, that can impair functions at the liver directly, including components around bile flow. And that can cause issues with bile flow, which can cause digestive issues in the intestine as well, pretty significant ones. Another one is the low stomach acid piece. This kind of goes with hypothyroidism, low calorie dieting. Also, as you get older, stomach acid decreases. And what happens in this circumstance is this can lead to bacteria being able to take up residence in the stomach and in the intestine because it's not being sterilized by the acid in our stomach. And then the last piece is dietary setup. So again, if carbs are too low, you won't be able to, you're running keto for a long period of time. People tend to get issues because they get the bile dumping. And you can also, I think, degrade the mucus lining over time because you don't have all of the carbohydrate necessary to maintain that same level of mucus lining. A lot of time you don't have adequate fiber in the diet on a low carb diets. So then that impairs colonic function because you need the fiber to produce short chain fatty acids to power the colon's energy metabolism. So you can start to see issues there. If you're not having enough fat, you can cause issues at the gallbladder because you don't have a trigger to release bile acids. So that's another problem. So these are other areas that could predispose to SIBO. I don't think people just get SIBO. They could also just predispose to bloating and gas, not even SIBO. But I think a lot of times SIBO is a function of something else. You don't just randomly get it. It's like there's a triggering initiating factor, as you were pointing out in the beginning. And it's important to figure out what that factor is, because oftentimes if that factor is not corrected and you go and do all these things and maybe you get a benefit, but you're still doing the same thing that led to the issue, well, it won't solve the problem. You'll probably just get it back again. And this is why in the studies where there's a drug that they use to treat SIBO called rifaximin, the relapse rate after using the drug is actually pretty high. And I think that's because if the things aren't corrected, then you're just like, it's just not going to solve the problem.
Right. So how long if you take that drug, how long does it last before you're going to see that relapse?
It depends person to person, but in some of the studies, they only saw 40% improvement.
Yeah.
So only 40% of people saw improvement in SIBO or resolution of SIBO. And then a lot of times I'll have clients, they've worked with other practitioners. They've gone to their GI doc. They give them rifaximin. They run it for 2 weeks. Nothing happens. Or they feel good for like maybe a week or 2 weeks after. And then the symptoms start to come back. So then they have to run it again. And they run it again. And it's like keeps setting that the stage up. And a lot of times it's like the diet or there's something else going on. Or maybe they're dealing with a different type of infection. If you go to Asia or go to India and you come back with a parasitic infection, rifaximin is not going to do anything for that. So It's important to figure out what the causes. In those cases, parasitic stuff and testing can be helpful overall.
Right. Right. Okay. So you want to recap?
Oh boy, sure.
Ready to recap? We'll just do like a short recap because that was like a lot of things. But basically, it's trial and error here in this recap, because if you haven't had a test done and you don't know if you have SIBO or not, and you've eliminated the FODMAPs and you're down that route and everything seems fine, but most likely it's not, because it's probably a FODMAP in there bothering you. Go down all of these trial and error sections and try to figure out what works for you and what doesn't. And then also try to figure out, does a raw food or a cooked food work better than a raw food, right? So you have to try these in raw and cooked form, because you might still be able to eat these foods just in a cooked form instead. So trial. Test, be a test subject for yourself.
Yeah, as you alluded to, fix the diet first, rule out the FODMAPs, rule out the food intolerances, see if something's there. If that's not the case, if it's like you do all that and maybe only get 50% improvement, look at whether you're eating enough calories, you're eating enough fat. Then you can start to consider hormonal issues and issues like low stomach acid and issues like SIBO. And you can rule those out with different supplements and different components like betaine HCl for stomach acid, increasing the fat content for bile acids, or trying to use a bile acid, see if that improves some of the symptoms. Make sure you have, another one is make sure your micronutrients are dialed in. A lot of times if B vitamins are low, or if there's low fat soluble vitamins, that can create issues. The B vitamins are important for maintaining intestinal function. And then the fat soluble vitamins are important for actually maintaining immune function inside the intestine. So you want to make sure those areas are dialed in and kind of move through it that way. So diet, micronutrients, test to see with a stomach, if there's a stomach acid thing with maybe betaine HCl, see if there's if there's something going on with bile acids, see if there's something going on with transit time, adjust the diet so that you're having meals probably 3 hours spaced apart to optimize migrating motor complex. And you can start to look into things like your hormonal function. You can start to look into things to see, or maybe try out some essential oils and some spore biotics to see if it helps to clear out what's going on in the small intestine in terms of if you have an infection. And then from there, if you really have to, start to do some testing, see if there's a parasitic thing, or if thyroid is off, or there's some type of imbalance in any of those different areas.
Right. All right. I hope you guys got that. Did you write all those notes down? Going to need some notes for this episode. All right, Mike, where can the people find you?
They can find me at mikefave.com. What about you, Chrissy?
Okay, you can find me right here on Health and Harmony or at chrissyrice.com. And thank you so much for listening. And if you have any suggestions for some podcast topics, please drop them in the comments. We love to hear from you and we take them.